All right, welcome to Kitchen Table. We're gonna turn this into this. Sourdough bread is kind of the basis of everything we do here. We start with the sourdough starter, which is basically a dough. It's living natural yeast supported by whole wheat flour, high gluten bread flour, and water. And that's really everything we've got here. There's some salt, but everything else is just flour and water. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add our starter.
Hey, yes, Jessica, I want to be in this show too.
To the water. This way the starter disperses throughout. Hi, Jackson.
Did he see me? Did you see me?
Please be quiet. Go back to school.
But did it see me?
Go back to school, please.
And so the ideal situation is when the starter floats. That's when you know it has enough air in it to really leaven the bread as it comes together. So we're going to disperse that starter throughout so that the leavening agent is even throughout the final dough. Just going to mix it through until those strands start to go away. So there we go. And it's come out clean. Good stuff. And then we're going to add our flour. We use a high gluten all trumps bread flour, and then 10% of a locally milled whole wheat flour. The locally milled flour is going to give, it's very fresh, so it's going to give that yeast something really, really nutritious to activate on. So we're going to add that whole wheat flour, red flour, and then we're going to put the mixer onto the mixer. We're going to use our dough hook. Lid started up, and we're going to mix this for about 2 minutes just until the dough comes together. Alright, so while that first batch is mixing, we're going to feed the starter for the next batch. So we always measure out the starter that we need for the batch, and then measure out an extra bit to refeed the starter. And this is what keeps it alive and keeps it going. Every time you mix a batch of bread, you feed your starter, and then it's ready for the next batch. So same thing, disperse that starter into the water. And the starter is pretty basic. It's equal parts flour and water, plus half as much starter. So I use a 4-kilo starter. So I've got 1,600 grams of water, 800 grams of starter, and then I've got 800 grams each of that whole wheat flour and the high gluten bread flour. So a total of 1,600 grams of flour. So I'm going to add that in now that the starter's dispersed, and then just by hand, bring that all together. Just to make a nice wet dough. It's going to live in the cooler. Unless you're mixing every 18 to 24 hours, you want to keep your starter in the cooler. Currently, we're mixing about every 48 hours. Under normal circumstances, we mix at least daily, sometimes twice a day. So now that we've got that nice kind of shaggy dough, you don't see any dry flour, but you can still feel some texture. Whatever excess we can off our hands.
Oh no.
Put the lid on. I'm going to change the date. It is the 19th of October at 1:20. We're going to write that on there, put it in the cooler, and it's good to go for the next batch 2 days from now. Still sticking. All right, so about a half an hour has passed. This bubble is a very good sign. It means that there's activity. The dough is breathing. It's good. So now we're going to add our salt, 2%. And then we're going to put a splash of water on the post so it doesn't climb up when we start mixing. We're going to add the rest of the water slowly. See how it's climbing, but it's going to drop back down as we add a little more water in. And you'll watch the dough will kind of break. As we add more water, it'll kind of turn into mush. Things start to fall apart. It gets real shiny. And that's just allowing the salt to incorporate all the way throughout the dough. Okay, once we get all our water in, just going to pull all that extra dough down off the post so it's starting to climb. Start it back up. Okay, and then once there's no more excess water, you can start to see the kind of strands starting to form around the edges of the bowl. It's starting to get kind of sticky there. Then we're going to turn it off, turn the speed up to medium. And we're going to let that roll for about 4 minutes. And what's happening now is the gluten strands, which if you think of gluten as little rings, they're connecting. The more you work the dough, the more the gluten strands connect and you get chains. And the chains build into a net. And the net is what's going to create the leavening as the starter eats the sugars in the flour and emits gases. The net is what's going to hold that dough together and allow the gases to leaven the bread and allow it to rise slowly but surely over the course of this process. Alright, so it's been about 3.5, 4 hours. The dough is about doubled in size. I'm going to peel back that plastic wrap. You can see some of these bubbles forming. It's pretty lively stuff. So it kind of breathes along with you. These bubbles come up. And then we're going to take some of that air back out of it to make it easier to work with. Now, this bulk ferment step you can definitely do in the cooler in the refrigerator overnight. It's going to make the dough a little easier to work with the next day. It's going to give you a little bit more of a sour flavor, but it's also going to really extend the second proofing time because your dough is going to be cold. So, first thing we're going to do to get it out of the proofing tub, we're going to go around the edges, pull the outside of the dough into the middle. It's going to knock some of that excess air out. And also release it completely from the sides. And just kind of reaffirm those gluten bonds that have already really developed when we mix the bread with the dough. Now you can see a lot of that air has come out. Lost quite a bit of volume, but it's still very airy and light. Bench flour. Generously on the table. We're just going to turn that whole dough out. apply flour over the top just so it doesn't stick to your hands. Just a dusting over the top just to smooth it out so it's no longer grabbing. It's not sticky. I should have taken these off before. Alright, so now we've got basic 2-pound scale, graduated by ounces. Each loaf of bread is going to be 2 pounds. Just going to put a little bit of flour on the scale. Cut away. Try to keep it somewhat round. You're going to get that 2 pounds. I got lucky. Doesn't always happen that way. And then lay it down, round it all the way around like this. Flip it, and then you're going to push away and bring it back. Push away and bring it back until you let the table grab the dough until it gets that nice smooth top, rounded on the bottom. You still got some air bubbles. You don't want to push too much. A little bit of flour on the top. Now this is going to be the outside of your bread. So we're going to turn that dough ball over and let it rest on the table upside down. Alright, so the dough balls have now rested for about 30 minutes. They're nice and fluffy, starting to get a little bit shiny on the backside. We're going to put a little bit of olive oil into the base of the pans. It helps the season of bread, also helps them get away in the pan when they're done. Going to kind of rub that in a little bit. And then we're going to take our dough knife. Make sure we cut these away nice and clean. Put a little flour down on the table. I'm going to scoop that first dough ball up. Kind of square it. Fold it up. Just tuck that seam in just a little bit, and then both sides into the middle. Just like an envelope. Tuck all that in. You don't want to push all the air out, but you want to make sure that seam is pretty sealed. And then get underneath there. Kind of roll it over. So you fold the envelope up like that. And you're just going to pinch that bottom seam. Just like that. So you got a nice cylinder. A little flour on your hand so it doesn't stick. And then you just kind of roll it, tucking the corners or the ends underneath. You're going to pick it up, kind of shake it out, and then lay it into that pan, tucking the edges in all the way around. The pan is actually going to provide the structure so that the bread will rise like a proper loaf. All you're doing is creating a nice, even cylinder of dough so that the pan can do its work.